talk is a big departure from the previous three in this session, in terms of subject matter, anyway. I'm going to talk about issues related to data science that, that I think as a statistician are important for its success as an emerging new field. And I'm going to motivate this talk, initially at least, with a story about cats. This comes from an article that appeared in the New York Times in August of 1989, and I don't know, you might consider it to be an early example of data journalism, but I'll read it out a little bit to you if you can't read it there. It says, the title is "On Landing Like a Cat, It's a Fact." Every year, scores of cats fall from open windows in New York City. From June the 4th through November the 4th of 1984, for instance, 132 such victims were admitted to the Animal Medical Center on 62nd Street in Manhattan. Most of the cats landed on concrete. Most survived. And it goes on to recite some statistics from this data set, like 21 of 22 falling 7 or more stories actually survived. 2 of them fell together. 40% fell at night. The height of the buildings ranged from 2 to 32 stories, with an average of 5.5. And the weird thing was that there seemed to be a positive relationship between the length of the fall and the probability of survival. So this is really strange, right? So what's going on here? Some of them surmised, maybe it's the 9 lives hypothesis, or maybe, they interview some experts that say, well, the cat had time to fall, and so it was able to turn or relax its body, or even kind of a flying squirrel thing where there are like flaps of skin underneath its arms. But the giveaway is actually in the first paragraph that I read out to you. It said, 132 such victims were admitted to the Animal Medical Center. All right? Dead cats are not transported to animal hospitals. And so the whole story had no basis, and the reason was it was based on this sort of found data, right? It's sort of a tale of caution in the interpretation of found data, and the reason is because this is what statisticians might call a convenience sample. It's expedient, it's available, it's not collected via any sort of sampling scheme, but it's being used to answer questions that weren't really intended by the collectors of the data. And of course, the issues with this data had to do with, the missing data. And missing data arises everywhere, with experiments, with observational studies, and of course with found data. But here, of course, the missingness was highly correlated with the outcome of interest, which was whether or not the cat survived or not. And so the data is what we'd call a non-representative sample. And by representative, we mean that it's related, that the data set in hand is the same as the underlying target population of interest. These are statistical issues, right? The inference from the cat data was unreliable because of ignorance of statistics, essentially. And so it's worth asking, in kind of the emerging era of big data, everyone take a drink, I guess it's too early for that, that statistical concerns perhaps are overlooked. But maybe these go away. Do these go away if we have large data sets, found or otherwise? So Twitter feeds, search results, that type of thing. And some people appear to think so. There was an article back in 2008 by Chris Anderson, writing in Wired, called The End of Theory. And it basically implied that, or didn't even imply, said it kind of outright, that correlation's good enough. Models aren't really required anymore. So with enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. But if you go back in history, there are some striking examples of the contrary. So I don't know if you heard this story before. This is ALFRED LANDON. In 1936, he was the Republican candidate for president, standing against FDR. And this is when FDR had just introduced the New Deal and kind of pissed some people off. So the Literary Digest, which was a popular, respected magazine at the time, undertook the responsibility of forecasting this election. So it conducted this postal opinion poll that aimed to reach 10 million people, which at the time was about a quarter of the US electorate. And they got 2.4 million returns back, which, it's not 10 million, but this is big data in 1936, right? And so they tabulated these votes over 2 months, and the result, the prediction was announced. Landon would win by pretty close to a landslide, we would say these days, right? Well, as you may have guessed, since we've never had a President Landon in the United States, that's the actual result. He was crushed 61 to 37. Let's just look at that map for a little bit. And so to add urine to the cornflakes, so to speak, there's another guy named George Gallup, a name that might sound familiar. He was the son of an Iowa dairy farmer who was into survey sampling, and he conducted his own opinion poll using a random sample. And he only sampled 50,000 people, and that's much smaller than 2.4 million, but actually quite large compared to today's poll. And he got much closer to the actual result. He predicted it was 66%. So random sampling was important here. A representative sample can only be assured by random sampling, and that's why we use it for things like clinical trials. So this is a clinical trial for an influenza vaccine on people with stem cell transplants, and you can see that the two groups, high-dose vaccine recipients and standard-dose vaccine recipients, their characteristics are relatively similar, and that's because they were sampled randomly. But of course, we can't always take random samples, right? In which case we need to, I'm arguing, build models to adjust for confounding factors, and I'll get into that in a bit. So the problem here is bias, and by bias, we don't mean like Fox News type bias that connotes judgment. We're talking about a systematically different estimate from the true population parameter, so wrong in the same direction all the time. So how did a very large male survey become so biased? Well, a few years later, the American Institute of Public Opinion did their own sample survey to determine the cause of the poor result. And you can see that those who did not receive a ballot or didn't know that they received a ballot were heavily biased towards FDR supporters. And what's more, even those who did receive a ballot, you can see that the Roosevelt supporters really didn't bother returning them most of the time. So by 1938, the Leary Digest had ceased publication. And this is a good example of self-selection bias. That was the cause of all of these problems. People could choose whether or not they returned the poll or not. So let's have a look at bias. This is the mathematical expression of bias. So if you have some quantity theta that we want to estimate, theta hat's our estimate of it, and so the bias is simply the difference between the expected value of theta hat and the true value. And so we can do a little experiment, a little simulation to see what happens to bias as we increase sample size. So here's the requisite Python code. It's just a little loop where we look at sample sizes from 10 to 100,000 in sort of orders of magnitude. And at each sample size, we're going to take 1,000 replicates from a standard normal distribution. So mean 0, variance 1. And what I'm going to do is each time I take a sample, if that sample's negative, if the value is negative, I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to make it missing with probability 0.5. So that's that p point of 0.5 up top. We're going to see what happens. So we're going to induce bias. And this happens a lot, right? Large values are often seen more easily than small values. This is what it looks like. So it's increasing in sample size along the x-axis. And what happens is actually the problem sort of gets worse, right? It doesn't change. The bias doesn't go away, certainly, with large sample sizes, but it actually gets worse because you're getting highly precise wrong answers as you collect more data. So why do we bother collecting all this data? What's the big deal about big data? Well, bias is only part of the story, right? So accuracy, you can summarize accuracy in terms of, say, mean squared error, and you can rearrange terms to show that there are two pieces to it. Variance is one piece, and that does decrease with sample size. It goes to 0, but bias doesn't move. It stays where it is. So quite apart from numbers being able to speak from itself, there seems to be a role for models and certainly statistical principles. And you'd think that given the importance of these principles on data analysis, that statisticians would be in quite great demand to contribute to the shaping of the future of data science. So let's look at some important meetings to see where we kind of fit in. So the White House had a meeting in 2013 called the Big Data Partners Workshop. They convened 19 participants, no statisticians. NSF, National Science Foundation Working Group on Big Data, 100 experts, nothing. Moore Foundation, which is an American foundation that develops projects related to environmental conservation, patient care, and science. No directors established with statistical expertise. How about the NIH, National Institutes of Health? BD2K, Big Data 2K Executive Committee, 17 members, no statisticians. So we're feeling a little left out. Our delicate feelings have been hurt. So we haven't been asked to give any advice, but you guys are all trapped here listening to me, so I'm going to give it to you anyway. My advice is more model-based inference. And by model-based inference, we mean build models, build statistical models, and use them to estimate things we care about. And we're talking about explicit models here, not implicit. You can argue that there's a model behind all this stuff. It's just an implicit one. This is harder to do. It's less automated. And part of the problem is on us. We don't really teach it to you when you take intro applied statistics courses, unless you take Alan's course. That may be different. He's an outlier. And in particular, we want to make data generating models to exactly account for the sorts of things that you saw in the election example and in the cat example. Because we don't have the luxury of random sampling. So by a data generating model, here's sort of a scenario where we might want to track or estimate some sort of system state of interest. And that may change over time, right? Things change. They're not static, and so there's some process model that links them and moves them to another time step. But of course, we observe data, right? So there's another sort of submodel in there that represents the fact that we can't directly observe the system, and so, like voters, and so there's an observation model in there. And so the model's built up of constituent pieces. This would be called a hidden Markov model or a state space model. I'm just going to give you an example from some of my own research to illustrate this. When I first got out of my PhD program, my first job was with the Florida Marine Research Institute, working for the state of Florida, and I was responsible for population modeling and estimation for the Florida manatee. And the manatee is an endangered coastal marine mammal at both the state and federal level, and it's endangered because of habitat loss. It gets hit by boats a lot, and it actually can't handle the cold in Florida in the wintertime, if you can believe it. And so we were interested in estimating the population size in order to monitor its population recovery and evaluate conservation measures. So what do? We go out and count the manatees. We get in airplanes, get biologists in airplanes, and then we fly around Florida and we count the manatees. And of course, it's impossible to see them all, right? And we don't know how many we've missed. We sometimes think of this count maybe as a lower bound, but we have no idea how different our count is from a true abundance. And so we need an observation model. And the problem is this. So here's, a little body of water that looks kind of like a weak Americano. No manatees that we can see there. There were actually manatees in this photo, but I pixel-mated them out. But if you don't see any manatees, there's a couple of reasons that could be. It could be there are no manatees. It's unoccupied, nothing there. Or it could be there are manatees, but they're underwater. They dive to the bottom and feed and so on. Or there could be manatees, and they could be at the surface, but like me, you don't have great vision, and you miss them. So there's sort of three components here. And we can model all of these as probabilities and use independent information in order to estimate them. So what we do is we attach satellite tags to a sample of them. And so when they dive, when they come to the surface, it communicates with the satellite. When it dives, it doesn't. We can estimate the probability of them being at the surface. In terms of visibility, we actually have replica manatees. Those aren't real manatees, those are replica manatees, and we submerge them at different levels in different water clarity conditions, and it allows us to estimate the probability of availability, that is, our ability to see them, as a function of something like water clarity or turbidity. And then we were in a position to actually do some random sampling. So we can't go fly all over Florida, but what we want to do is we want to randomly sample pieces of Florida, and we want to stratify it and sample heavier in areas where we expect more manatees. So we have to get a representative sample. So we got a representative sample, and we were able to correct for some of these confounding factors. And now, so all the bars are synoptic counts from years going back to the early 90s, and then the little box and whisker plots are our new estimates. And notice now we have an estimate of uncertainty, and we have some idea of the true number of manatees. And this works because of a detailed model of the data, multiple independent data sources, to estimate these confounding factors and an adequate sampling scheme. Now, things can go wrong when you don't account for the data generating model, and a now famous example is the Google Flu Trends project. And this was a public health tool by the charitable arm of Google, and it was published with much fanfare in Nature in 2008, and it uses 50 million potential search terms, of which they found about 45 that fit well, and it was touted as a victory for big data. Now, it wasn't touted by the Google Flu team, right? This was not, they realized the limitations of this sort of an undertaking. It was completely hyped by people outside of the project. But it was hyped because, it didn't require a model. There was no epidemiology knowledge required. And actually, the promise for this was great, because if it works, it's fantastic. Surveillance for diseases is hard, it's expensive, and it's slow. So this had a much faster turnaround time than the CDC reports. And so in 2009, I don't think I have a pointer here, but you can see in 2009 it massively underestimated things. And of course, that was the big breakout year. That was the pandemic year. So that's fine. They adjusted the model, and that's where that discontinuity comes in. And it predicted well for a while, and then started to drastically overestimate. So about 100 of the last 108 weeks were pretty drastic overestimates, and potentially causing panic when there was no panic to observe. And so it was that didn't really work out. And of course, again, it was never touted as a replacement, but it was kind of the victim of hype. But the approach was eventually improved by how? By combining the information from this with more traditional data sources and tools and sampling. Now let's end with a good story. A good data science story, I think, is of course, the prediction of the 2012 US federal election by 538 and Nate Silver. And this is a really good data science story, but it's not a data story, right? It really isn't a data story. The model itself is proprietary, but Silver has talked in general terms about how it was done. But there's, just like the manatees and the sketch that I had before, there's a process model here where there's, voter Obama's support was maybe the variable you're trying to estimate, and then there's voter dynamics. They change over time due to a number of factors. And then, of course, we don't directly observe the voters. We have polling, and that's affected by external factors. So we got to account for things like, a national result is some formula based on state-based returns. And so on a given day, not all states are polled, and these state polls and national polls have to be combined. So that's some modeling that needs to be done. And of course, not only do we not observe all the data or the voters directly, but we entrust pollsters to do that for us, and all the pollsters are biased. But we have that prior information from previous elections, and so that can also be incorporated. And so you build up a model, right? We have our true voter intention that we want to estimate, and then pollster effects, and this is just uber simplified model I made up, and then a poll result, the Y, is what we actually observe. And then of course it's all probabilistic, right? So you can use stochastic simulation to estimate the probability of winning a given state or the country as a whole, and that's appears to be how it was done. It's sort of a deft application of both sound statistical principles and also some good modeling. So data science I think is a great thing. I think it sort of represents the democratization of statistical analysis and a sign that maybe the world's becoming a little more empirical and evidence-based. I have two major problems with it. One is the data part, and the other is the science part. The data part, you occasionally hear people, analysts say, "Oh, I do this job because I love data. I love data," and that always strikes me as a bit weird, right? Because data is kind of boring. Questions are interesting, but also data can actively be hostile to you answering your questions sometimes, depending on the data that you're using. And folks like Chris Anderson apply that the power's in the data, and that's where the focus should be, and I think that's wrong. The data is the fuel for the car. It's not the car itself. On the science side of things, there's nothing particularly scientific about data mining. And I think there has to be models, and I hope I've shown some of that to you here. Statisticians have learned many hard-won lessons over the last 100 years or so, and it would be a shame not to learn from them. So that's my message. And have I got any time left for questions? 5 minutes. Thank you. It depends on what part of your career you're at. If you're still a student, you can be smart about picking where you go to school and talk to people. It's always good to talk to statisticians and successful, listen to people like Nate Silver and famous people that appear to do things well. But collaboration is always the key, right? So I work in a medical center, and my background is actually biology. It's not statistics. And you can't do anything on your own these days, right? Any interesting question is a product of team at every sort of level. And so you don't have to do all this yourself. I think the best way is always collaboration. And then you get the side benefit of learning from your collaborators. So just get involved. I would say get involved with projects where you might learn something, and don't try to do it all yourself. I think scikit-learn is so easy and nice to use that you can do it all on your own sometimes. More and more of these packages are very, very accessible, which is good on the one hand, but on the other, it allows you to do the work yourself, and perhaps that's not always the best way. So the question was, can I talk a bit more about the analysis, the sort of pitfalls of the analysis side of things rather than the data issues? Well, you can't get us started, right? Yeah, I mean, we don't. The big issue again, I think, is that we don't really get taught the right things in most programs that we take, particularly if you're not a statistician. But even if you are a stats major, I don't think they teach everything we need to oftentimes, and if you're not a statistician, it's almost completely hopeless. You got to learn it pretty much on your own. So, gee, I don't know about any specific stuff, but we can talk in the hall a little bit if you want to. But yeah, there's pitfalls all around. But this was my story today. Where's oh. It may be a semantic thing. I wasn't attacking machine learning. I use machine learning methods all the time. The difference might be prediction versus inference, I suppose. But you can do prediction with regular statistical models too. So the model can take a variety of forms, and I won't prescribe what form it needs to be. Sometimes they're very black box-ish, like machine learning models can be, and sometimes they're very structured, like a Bayesian hierarchical model. You pick the tool to fit the problem. So yeah. Any other questions? Thanks.